Hey friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is continuing our study of the book of Romans, a bit slower than we've read it in the past. This lecture will focus on Romans 12 through 13, chapters 12 through 13. I want to start with just a sort of overview of where this is in Paul's letter to the Romans. Some people talk about the Pauline letters as having two basic parts. There's the sort of the expositional part or the theological part, and then there is the sort of practical or exhortative part. And that sort of dichotomy between those two parts doesn't always hold up in Paul's letters. It's not Paul is not necessarily that crystal clear in how he structures his letters, but it can be a helpful way of thinking about it. And so in chapter 12, Paul really changes the focus. His tone changes from what we would call theological exposition, from explaining his understanding of the good news and its implications and dealing with some questions of clarity or even pushback from an imaginary conversation partner. And so in chapter 12, we get what I would call the sort of the now what section of Romans, where the gospel is not just a message, it's not just propositional, it's meant to shape how individuals and communities live their lives. And so this is the now what. This is the response to Paul's early theological work. But don't be surprised if there's still theological exposition in chapters 12 through 16. Again, that rigid break is usually not a true one when it comes to Paul's letters. With that in mind, I wanted to sort of give you a reminder or a recap of the ancient context in which Paul is writing and to whom he is writing, to those Christians living in Rome. Remember that as we're going to see later in his letter, chapter 16, Paul is writing not to just one community, but it seems to be multiple communities, multiple churches. There's some indications that there are Jewish believers in Christ who have sort of begun to meet together in the city of Rome, and there's former Gentiles or Gentiles who are gathering together, and maybe there are some churches that are mixed groups. But it's, I think, important for us to keep in mind that, as we'll learn later, there's some division among these communities. They're all recipients of this letter. They're all intended to be hearers of this letter, but they're not all on the same page. They're a divided community and a set of communities at that. A second thing for us to notice about the context is that these Christ believers, these followers of the way, these people who have oriented themselves to the God of Israel as revealed by Jesus Christ, hold a minority status within their broader social, religious, and political context. They are a third thing, as a later church father would put it, a third thing between Judaism and paganism, or the wider Roman religions of the day. And so, as we are thinking about that, their minority status in that regard, very few of them were probably actual citizens of Rome or of the empire. And so, at the very least, many of them would have been perceived as strange by their non-Christian neighbors, if not a danger, leading to some form of persecution. And so this minority status is, I think, at play when we hear Paul talk about the now what in these chapters. And then the third thing that I would say about this context is I think Paul is in the business of crafting, curating, feeding an alternative community in these letters. So he is going to provide practices and dispositions for communal formation and transformation. And I think it's important that even though there are some elements of command and exhortation in here that we might read pretty individually, that the broad emphasis throughout chapters 12 through 16 is on the community and that they belong to one another, and that the choices that they make about how they lead their lives and what they do, they're accountable to one another. And that Paul is in the business again of shaping that whole community, not just individuals within that community. And I would say that since the Enlightenment, the Christian church has struggled probably with the reverse, right? That we tend to focus on individual transformation, individual formation, my relationship with God, and attention to the community sometimes comes second. But I think Paul's focus is the alternative, right? Focus on the community, and the individual within that community. Finally, just a few notes about what I think you're going to see in this section of exhortation, this section of now what in Romans. The first, I think you're going to see in chapters 12 and 13 that how we think matters. That what goes on in our perception and how we see the world and how we see other people and how we see ourselves, all of this matters. And Paul is going to have a lot to say about that. And so pay attention, think through this process of thinking and what Paul says about it in this section. A second part of these two chapters is love, 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 and love, right? There is love all over the place. There's several different layers to this love, but the command to love one another is a persistent voice in these chapters. And then another element that perhaps is more subtle, but I think still present, is an exhortation to pay attention, to remember where you're at, to locate yourself in God's design, in God's history, in God's future, and so forth. So as you read Romans 12 through 13, here are three things, three questions, if you will, to consider as you read. One is, what is the community intended to be like? And what are the characteristics of this alternative community? So what is the community intended to be like, and what are its characteristics? Two is an invitation, and that is to read these two chapters once, thinking about the ancient context, thinking about the first century Roman context, and then read them a second time, thinking about your own context, our own context, 21st century America. Most of us are in the urban South, right? And pay attention then to the similarities and differences of how these words might be applied, how they might be lived down in the ancient context as opposed to the modern one. And then a final question is, according to Romans 12 through 13, what does love look like? What does love look like? What does it entail? What does it demand? What does it require? That's the Before You Read lecture for Romans 12 through 13. I look forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts about these chapters. And for now, happy reading.